The text arrived at 6:47 p.m. on a Friday, the same as it had for 104 Fridays before it. The notification sound, a gentle chime I'd once chosen for him, had become a Pavlovian trigger for a specific kind of hollowness. It was the sound of an evening being canceled, the sound of a key turning in a lock that was hours away. I was standing at the kitchen island, a head of garlic in one hand, a knife in the other, about to start the bolognese he loved. The rich, savory smell of the onions and carrots I'd already prepped hung in the air, a promise I knew, even before I looked at the screen, would not be kept for him. The phone lit up on the cool granite, and the 4 words glowed in the dimming light of the kitchen. "Working late. Don't wait up." I didn't have to read them. I knew the script. I put the knife down, its blade catching the light from the pendant lamp above. I did not pick up the phone. I simply stared at the head of garlic, its papery skin seeming impossibly fragile, and felt the familiar, quiet erasure of my own plans. The refrigerator hummed, a low, constant vibration that suddenly felt like the only other living thing in the room. This was the moment, not of decision, that had been made weeks ago in the silent rows of a spreadsheet, but of recognition. This was the last time, the last text, the last warm meal that would cool on the stovetop, waiting for no one. My name is Adrienne. I am 35 years old. My husband, Brennan, was 39. We had been married for 8 years, together for 10. Long enough for the landscape of a person to feel like your native geography, a place you believe you can navigate by heart, even in the dark. I work as a hospital billing manager. My days are spent in the world of codes and ledgers, of services rendered and accounts to be settled. In my world, everything must balance. Every procedure, every medication, every night spent in a sterile room has a corresponding charge, a line item that must be accounted for. For a system to remain solvent, it requires diligence, accuracy, and a clear-eyed understanding that nothing is free. I was good at my job because I understood the intricate, often invisible infrastructure that allowed a massive institution to function. I saw the connections, the dependencies, the consequences of a single unpaid bill cascading through the system. For 8 years, I ran my marriage on a different principle. I believed it operated on a system of grace, of uncounted favors and unspoken understanding. I was wrong. It was a ledger all along, a deeply imbalanced one, and the debt was all mine. The conversation that changed everything, the one that provided the title for the final closing entry in my mental file, happened on a Saturday morning about 6 months ago. It was the morning after the 90-something Friday night he'd worked late. I was making pancakes for our 2 children, Maya and Leo, the sweet smell of batter hitting the hot griddle filling the kitchen. Brennan came in, smelling of a soap that wasn't ours and the faint, stale air of a long night. He kissed the top of my head, a casual gesture of ownership, and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made an hour earlier. "Morning," he said, his voice a little rough. "Smells good in here." I flipped a pancake, my movements measured. I wasn't angry. Anger had been burned out of me long ago, leaving behind a cool, fine ash of resignation. "Morning. Hard night?" "The usual," he said, leaning against the counter. "You know how it gets at the end of the quarter." It was always the end of the quarter. For 2 years, Brennan's company had apparently been trapped in a perpetual, Sisyphean fiscal cycle. I slid a pancake onto Maya's plate. "I just worry about you, Brennan. Every single Friday. It seems like a lot." My voice was even, gentle. It was a statement of concern, the kind a wife is supposed to make. He smiled then, a tired but self-satisfied expression. He took a sip of his coffee and looked at me with what he thought was affection. It was something else entirely. It was appraisal. He was appraising a well-functioning appliance. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said. "You handle everything. The kids, the house. You never give me a hard time." He paused, and then delivered the line that would echo in my mind for weeks, the line that I would type into the final column of my spreadsheet. "You never questioned it because you trust me. That's what I love about you." He thought it was a compliment. I heard it for what it was, a confession. He wasn't praising my trust. He was praising my inaction. He loved that I didn't ask questions. He loved that I didn't demand proof. He loved my silence because it was the fertile ground in which his excuses could grow, unquestioned and uninspected. My trust wasn't a sacred bond to him. It was a loophole, a feature he could exploit. In that moment, standing in my sun-drenched kitchen, with the sound of my children's laughter in the background, I understood that he hadn't just been working late. He had been working on a different life, one that ran on a separate set of books, and he loved me for never asking to see the audit. The archaeology of our marriage began that afternoon. While the kids napped, I opened my laptop, not to search for clues on his phone or to check bank statements. The evidence I needed wasn't external. It was internal. It was the slow, steady erosion of my own life, my own expectations, my own presence in our partnership. I created a simple spreadsheet, the kind I used at work to track outstanding claims. I named the file Friday_log. Column A, date. Column B, time of text. Column C, excuse given. Column D, my emotional response. I started with the most recent Friday and worked backward, pulling the texts from my phone. The data was shockingly consistent. The texts always arrived between 6:30 and 7 p.m. The excuses were vague, corporate-sounding phrases. Buried in reports. Client dinner ran long. Trying to hit this deadline. At first, he'd used the line, "You know how it gets at the end of the quarter?" But when I gently pointed out that quarters only have 4 ends a year, he'd shifted to more generic, unprovable reasons. The first few entries in column D were filled with words like worried, disappointed, lonely. I remembered those early nights. I'd keep his dinner warm, wrapping the plate in foil and setting it in the oven. I'd put the kids to bed, reading them extra stories to fill the echoing silence of the house. I'd sit on the sofa with a book, but my eyes would drift to the clock every few minutes. I'd send a simple text back. "Okay, be safe." Around month 7, I stopped replying. My silence wasn't a protest. It was exhaustion. It was the quiet acknowledgement that my response didn't matter. It wasn't part of the transaction. The transaction was him informing me of his absence. My acceptance was assumed. My little okay was a line item he no longer required. As I populated the spreadsheet, scrolling back through months, then a year, then further, the entries in column D began to change. Disappointed became resigned. Lonely became numb. After about 18 months, the entries became sparser. Sometimes I just typed a single word, tired. Towards the end, for the last dozen or so Fridays, the column was blank. I had nothing left to feel about it. It was no longer an event. It was a condition of my life, like the weather. Friday meant Brennan was gone. The spreadsheet stared back at me, a sterile grid-lined monument to my own quiet diminishment. 104 rows. 2 years. This pattern of absence wasn't confined to Fridays. It bled into the rest of our life, staining everything with his casual disregard. The invisible labor I performed was the very infrastructure of our family, and like all good infrastructure, it was completely taken for granted. He saw the smoothly paved road. He never saw the crew that worked all night to lay the asphalt. Every April, I became our family's unpaid accountant. I'd gather the documents, our W-2s, the mortgage interest statement, the receipts for the kids' daycare, the donation acknowledgments from the church. I'd set everything up on the dining room table, my reading glasses perched on my nose, the tax software humming on my laptop. For 3 years in a row, I'd placed his pile of documents, pay stubs, 401k statements, on his side of the table. And for 3 years, the pile sat there, untouched, a small paper cairn to his disengagement. The first year, I asked him to review the numbers with me. He waved a hand dismissively. "You've got it, Ads. You're the numbers person." The second year, I just filled it all out myself. When I was done, I printed the signature pages and put them on his desk with a sticky note. He signed where I'd flagged without reading a single line. This past April, I didn't even bother making him a pile. I logged into his payroll portal myself, downloaded his W-2, and filed for us. He signed the e-file authorization on his phone while watching a basketball game. He saw it as efficiency. I saw it as a complete abdication of his role as a partner. He wasn't trusting me. He was delegating the entirety of our shared financial responsibility to me, then taking his half of the refund without a flicker of acknowledgement for the hours of tedious work it required. His disengagement extended to the children. He loved them in his way, a kind of loud, performative weekend fatherhood. He was great at tossing a ball in the yard or taking them for ice cream. He was terrible at the mundane, relentless logistics of their lives. The doctor's appointments, the parent-teacher conferences, the daily scramble of school pickup. I managed it all. My calendar was a complex tapestry of color-coded alerts and reminders, a secret second job I did for free. I remember one Tuesday afternoon, I was in a critical meeting with 3 senior vice presidents at the hospital. My phone buzzed on the table, face down. I ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Finally, I glanced at it. It was the school. Maya had a fever. I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach. It was Brennan's day for pickup. I had triple-checked with him that morning. I excused myself from the meeting, my face burning with embarrassment, and called him. "Hey, what's up?" He answered, his voice casual. In the background, I could hear the distinct chatter of a coffee shop. "Brennan, the school just called. Maya's sick. You were supposed to be on call for pickup today." There was a pause. "Oh, damn. Was that today? I completely forgot. I'm in a meeting across town, Ads. There's no way I can get there." It wasn't a meeting. It was coffee. And he hadn't forgotten. To forget something, you have to have remembered it in the first place. My meticulously curated shared calendar was just another notification he swiped away. I had to go back into that boardroom, apologize to my bosses, and explain that I had a family emergency. I saw the flash of annoyance in their eyes before it was replaced with professional sympathy. I had built a reputation for being unshakably reliable, and in that moment, Brennan's carelessness had put a crack in it. I picked up my daughter, her little body warm and limp against my shoulder, and drove home, the weight of being the sole responsible adult pressing down on me so hard I could feel it in my bones. He came home that evening full of apologies that sounded more like excuses. "Work has been insane," he said, as if that explained everything. He didn't seem to grasp the real consequence, that his unreliability forced me to be unreliable in my own professional life, that his freedom was purchased at the cost of mine. Even our happy memories began to feel contaminated, poisoned by my new understanding. I thought back to our 5th anniversary. He had surprised me with a weekend trip to a beautiful bed and breakfast in the Blue Ridge Mountains. At the time, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. He'd handled everything: the booking, the babysitter, the itinerary. We had a wonderful time. He was charming, attentive, the man I had fallen in love with. During a candlelit dinner, he raised his wine glass. "To Adrienne," he said, his eyes sparkling, "for making everything so easy, for being the rock that lets me go out and slay dragons." I had glowed, feeling seen and appreciated. Now, replaying that moment in my mind, the words curdled, making everything so easy. It wasn't a toast, it was a job description. He wasn't celebrating me, he was celebrating my function. I was the stable foundation that allowed him to build whatever life he wanted without having to worry about the plumbing or the electricity. My ease was not a gift I gave him, it was a resource he consumed. The entire trip, once a cherished memory, now felt like a performance review, a bonus paid to a valuable employee to ensure she remained motivated. The dragons he was slaying, I now suspected, were not deadlines at work. They were the tedious demands of a life he had happily outsourced to me. The breaking point wasn't a single event. It was the cumulative weight of all those moments, quantified and laid bare in the sterile grid of my spreadsheet. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Brennan was out playing golf, his Saturday night excuse having been a late-night server migration. The kids were playing quietly in their room. I opened the file, Friday_log.xlsx, for what would be the last time. I scrolled down. Row after row of his absence, my endurance. Row 52, the end of year 1. Row 87, the row where the my emotional response column went blank for the first time. Row 104, last Friday. The data was irrefutable. No real job, no matter how demanding, had a crisis that occurred with such perfect, predictable regularity every Friday evening for 2 straight years. This wasn't a pattern of overwork. This was a schedule. This was an appointment. This was a second life, meticulously cordoned off from the one we shared. And the most chilling part was that I had built the evidence myself. He hadn't left a clue. There was no lipstick on his collar, no suspicious credit card receipts I'd stumbled upon. He had been so confident in my lack of questioning, in the trust he claimed to love, that he hadn't even bothered to be creative. He had used the same template, week after week, because he knew I would file it away without inspection. I stared at the screen, at the 104 neatly documented instances of his betrayal, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not heartbreak, not even sadness. I felt a profound and unnerving stillness. It was the same feeling I got at work after months of reconciling a hopelessly complex account. The moment when, after all the chaos and confusion, you find the single erroneous entry that explains everything. The moment when all the messy, emotional noise resolves into a single, clear, mathematical fact. The system balanced. The discrepancy was him. In that quiet house, a decision that had been forming in the deep, unlit parts of my mind for months surfaced, fully formed and absolute. It wasn't a storm of emotion. It was the quiet, bloodless click of a final account being closed. The debt was unpayable. The only option left was to write it off. I closed the laptop. The audit was complete. The week that followed was an exercise in surreal calm. I moved through my life with a kind of detached precision, an observer in my own home. On the surface, nothing changed. I made breakfast, I packed lunches, I went to work, I picked up the kids. I was the perfect, functioning infrastructure he had come to depend on. But internally, I had already left. I was simply executing a departure plan. On Monday, during my lunch break, I closed my office door and called a name I'd gotten from a colleague, a sharp, no-nonsense family law attorney in Midtown. I explained my situation in the same calm, factual tone I used to discuss delinquent hospital accounts. I had dates, times, a documented pattern of behavior. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I presented my case like a report. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Williams, the attorney, Ms. Davies, finally said, her voice tinged with a professional respect I hadn't realized I was starving for. You have done most of my work for me. This is the most well-documented case of constructive abandonment I've ever seen. Constructive abandonment. The phrase resonated deep in my bones. He hadn't physically left, but he had withdrawn the entirety of his presence, his support, his partnership. He had abandoned the marriage in every way but geographically. By Friday, the retainer was paid and the paperwork was being drafted. The irony of that week was almost unbearable. With the decision made, a strange peace had settled over me, and it must have shown. Brennan, oblivious, interpreted my calm as contentment. He was more affectionate than he had been in months. He'd wrap his arms around me while I was washing dishes, telling me how much he appreciated how smooth our life was. He saw a placid lake, not realizing it was frozen solid. On Wednesday evening, he was watching TV while I was on my laptop at the dining table, reviewing the draft of the divorce petition. He looked over at me, a lazy smile on his face. "What are you working on so intensely over there?" he asked. "Just some stuff for work," I said, not looking up from the screen where the words, irretrievably broken, were listed under grounds for divorce. He chuckled. "You're always working on something. You keep our whole world spinning, Ads." He turned back to the TV, satisfied. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, he looked at me with a pensive expression. "You know," he said, "I feel like we've been in a really good place lately. You seem happy." I met his eyes in the mirror. I gave him a small, neutral smile. He continued, mistaking my silence for agreement. "It's good. I was worried for a while you were getting stressed out." He paused, then delivered the line, a perfect bookend to his earlier confession about my trust. "I figured you'd bring it up if something was bothering you." I just nodded, turning away to pull back the covers on my side of the bed. "You figured wrong," I thought. "You figured I was an alarm system that would sound if breached. You never considered I might be a silent one that simply records the intrusion and alerts the authorities later. You thought my voice was the only indicator of my pain. You had no idea how to read my silence. The following Tuesday was the day. I woke up at the usual time. I got the kids ready for school. I made Brennan coffee. I kissed him goodbye at the door, a light, dry press of my lips to his. It felt like kissing a stranger. I went to work. I signed the final documents with Ms. Davies on my lunch break. The process server was scheduled to arrive at his downtown office at 3 p.m. I left work early that day and picked up the kids. I took them to my sister Sarah's house. She knew what was happening. When I had called her the week before to tell her, her only response was a quiet, "It's about damn time." She opened her door, took one look at my face, and pulled me into a hug. She took the kids to the backyard to play, leaving me in the quiet of her kitchen. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't clear out my closet or take my name off the mailbox. My exit was not a dramatic act of removal. It was a cessation of service. Everything in our house was exactly as he had left it that morning. His favorite mug was clean in the cupboard. His side of the bed was made. The life I had curated for him was perfectly intact, a museum exhibit of a marriage, waiting for a curator who had just walked off the job. The statement wasn't what I took. It was what I had stopped giving. My presence, my labor, my unquestioning, convenient trust. His confusion, I knew, would be the first message. His dawning realization that the entire system had been running on a power source he never even knew was plugged in, that would be the consequence. The first call came at 3:17 p.m. I was sitting at my sister's kitchen table, a mug of tea growing cold in my hands. I saw Brennan's picture flash on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. A second later, a text. "Call me. Now." Another call. 3:19 p.m. Voicemail. Another text. "What is this? This has to be a mistake." The calls and texts became a frantic staccato rhythm against the calm of Sarah's house. Shock. Denial. His messages were a flurry of questions, demands, accusations of a clerical error. He was trying to debug a system he didn't understand, looking for a simple glitch to explain a total system failure. I watched the phone light up again and again, my face impassive. Sarah came in and slid the phone to the far end of the counter, out of my line of sight. By 5 p.m., the tone of the voicemails shifted. The shock had curdled into anger. "What the hell is wrong with you, Adrienne?" His voice snarled from the tiny speaker when Sarah checked it. "You pull a stunt like this, out of nowhere, without saying a word? You're being ridiculous. You're being manipulative. After everything I do for this family, you do this to me." Everything he did. The words hung in the air. The man who worked every Friday night, who signed tax forms without reading them, who forgot which day he was supposed to pick up his own sick child, was now casting himself as the sole provider, the aggrieved party. It was so predictable, it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so sad. The next stage was negotiation. 2 days of my silence must have terrified him, because on Thursday his texts became pleading. "Okay, I get it. I've been working too much. It's been stressful. We can fix this. I'll cut back. I promise. We can go to counseling. Whatever you want." The offers he would never have made when he had me. The compromises that only became possible when he was faced with the loss of the comfort I provided. He wasn't trying to save our marriage. He was trying to restore his services. Finally, he must have realized that I was not going to respond to his digital barrage. On Saturday morning, he showed up at Sarah's house. She let him in but stood in the doorway of the living room, a silent, unmovable guard. The kids were at the park with her husband. It was just us. He looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes were wrinkled. The carefully constructed facade of the successful, in-control husband was gone. He looked like what he was, a man whose infrastructure had collapsed. He started to talk, a torrent of words, of justifications, of promises. I let him speak, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I was no longer a participant in this drama. I was an observer from the front row. When he finally ran out of steam, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for an answer, for a reason, for anything that would make sense of his world turning upside down. And then he said it. The line that was the thesis statement of his entire worldview, the words that proved he had never understood me or us at all. "I just don't get it, Adrienne," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I thought we were fine. You never said anything was wrong." I looked at him, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something. It wasn't anger. It was a distant, clinical pity. He truly believed it. He believed that a problem only existed if it was spoken aloud in a register he was willing to hear. My silence, my quiet endurance, my steady management of our life. He had registered all of it as contentment. I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, even, devoid of accusation. It was the voice I used at work to explain a final, non-negotiable bill. I redefined his words. "You're right," I said softly. "I didn't say anything." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "My silence was the thing you told me you loved most about me." The color drained from his face. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as the logic of my statement locked into place. He had celebrated my silence, and now he was being destroyed by it. He had mistaken the absence of complaint for the absence of pain. He had loved my trust, not because it was a bond, but because it was a blindfold. And now that I had taken it off, he was stunned that I had been seeing all along. The weeks that followed were a blur of logistics. Finding a new apartment, enrolling the kids in a school nearby, dividing assets. I handled it with the methodical efficiency of closing out a major account. I was not vindictive. I was fair. I wanted nothing more than my share and my freedom. My vindication wasn't financial. It was the quiet, steady rhythm of my new life. My resolution didn't come in the form of a dramatic courtroom victory or a triumphant new relationship. It arrived on a Friday night, about a month after I had left. It was the first Friday in 2 years that I had nowhere to be, no one to wait for. The kids were asleep in their new rooms, their breathing soft and even in the quiet apartment. I was sitting on my new sofa, a cup of tea in my hand, a book open on my lap. And I realized, with a jolt that was both startling and peaceful, that I wasn't waiting. The low-level anxiety, the constant humming anticipation of the 6:47 p.m. text, was gone. The space in the evening that had been carved out by his absence was no longer a void. It was just my time. The silence in the apartment wasn't the sound of loneliness. It was the sound of peace. I didn't need to fill it with anything. It was enough just to sit in it, to own it. That was the victory, not in what I had gained, but in what I had lost. The weight of waiting for a man who was never coming home. I saw Brennan 6 months later. We were both at the same grocery store on a Sunday afternoon for the kid exchange. I saw him before he saw me. He was standing in the cereal aisle, looking at the brightly colored boxes with a lost expression. He looked smaller somehow, less polished. His shirt was untucked on one side. He was no longer the imposing figure from my old life. He was just a man, trying to remember which brand of cereal his son liked. He saw me and gave a small, hesitant smile. "Hey, Ads." "Brennan," I nodded. Our conversation was brief, logistical, about schedules and a missing soccer cleat. There was no anger between us anymore, no tension. There was just a vast, quiet distance. Looking at him, I didn't feel rage or regret. I felt like a hospital billing manager looking at a closed account from a previous fiscal year. The transactions were complete. The balance was 0. It was history. It was just paperwork. We are taught that love shouldn't keep score, that a good marriage runs on uncounted kindnesses and unconditional grace. But a partnership is a living system, and like any system, it requires balance. It needs mutual input, regular maintenance, and a shared understanding of its own operational demands. When one person becomes the entire infrastructure, the power grid, the water main, the road crew, it ceases to be a partnership. It becomes a utility. And the thing about a utility is that it's invisible, taken for granted, and only ever truly noticed when it shuts down. For years, I audited everyone's accounts but my own. At the hospital, I chased down discrepancies, reconciled mismatched ledgers, and ensured every service was accounted for. I was relentless in pursuit of balance. But at home, I allowed a massive, growing debt to accumulate year after year without ever issuing an invoice. The final audit was the most painful one of my life. It showed a deficit of presence, of partnership, of care, a debt that could never be repaid because the debtor had never even known he was borrowing. You can't collect on an absence. You can only close the account and walk away from the loss. The silence in my home now is different. It is not an empty space waiting to be filled. It is not the sound of someone's absence. It is the sound of my own presence, full and complete. It is the sound of a ledger that is finally, perfectly balanced. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.